Israel strikes multiple targets inside Syria, including airfields, military vehicles, and weapons production sites to keep them from falling into the hands of the rebels. Meanwhile, both the Biden administration and the UN considering removing HTS, now the largest rebel force currently in charge of Syria, from their designated terrorist lists. The administration initially deemed them a terrorist list, but then HTS was placed on the terrorist list 9 years ago after being linked to al-Qaeda, but then they were put in charge of Syria just last week. Joining me now is UN Watch Executive Director Hillel Neuer. Hillel, nice to have you back. Welcome. Your reaction to all that has taken place in Syria?
Well, there was an extraordinary window of opportunity. Israel destroyed some 350 targets, including fighter jets, drones, tanks, missiles, and even a research center that was linked to a chemical weapons program. There's a lot of people in the Middle East who are very thankful that the tools of death of the Assad regime, which are about to be handed over to a whole array of jihadists, have been eliminated.
How would you assess this most recent last month in terms of what's going on? Israel pushing back very aggressively, successful in terms of, tamping down Hezbollah and Hamas. Assess the situation for us today.
Look, for a year, the Biden administration kept trying to restrain Israel, said, don't escalate, right? Don't go into Rafah, don't go into Lebanon, don't do this. And had Israel followed that advice, Assad would still be holding his torture chambers, which we're discovering are horrifying and unspeakable. Hamas would still be in full control of Gaza. Hezbollah, which helped Assad commit the genocide, would be in control. And the Iranian regime would be extending its noose all around the Middle East.
Unbelievable. So you said earlier, what did you call it? The fall of the Berlin Wall type
This is a
moment.
Berlin Wall type moment. The mullahs in Tehran are watching thousands of Syrian soldiers remove their uniforms and escape, and they've got to be going to sleep at night wondering if their troops are next and if the toll is coming, if the bell is coming to toll for them.
Well, this is quite extraordinary. As President Trump is walking into his second term, you're seeing a much weaker Iran, aren't you?
Absolutely. And they were dominating the region. They controlled terror proxies in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Gaza. And now Hamas is decimated. Hezbollah is decimated. Assad regime is gone. The noose of fire that they threatened to strangle and destroy Israel is gone. And the question is whether Tehran is next. And we have to be ready to support the men and women of Iran who deserve freedom, as do many other people in the Middle East.
Yeah, and that's why I've been having Reza Pahlavi on a lot, the Crown Prince. Your thoughts? Mahek, jump in here.
Well, and I have to ask, we have to look at Iran, right? Because they were the ones that were truly fighting this proxy war against Israel. They had so many conduits and ways that they were attacking without directly being involved. I think all fingers actually point to Iran, and we have a lot of terrorists cells, terror network cells there. So we really have to go back to what was the core of this issue, and I think it starts and ends with Iran. And if we take our foot off the gas, in my opinion, this is going to come back in full force at some point after President Trump's administration. So what's your recommendation there in terms of honing into Iran's regime and making sure this never happens again? We have an opportunity to make sure we get rid of all of these cells.
Absolutely. Tehran is the head of the octopus. The terror proxies were the tentacles. And now this is the main question, is what is the new administration going to do? Sadly, Obama and Biden had freed up billions of dollars by taking off sanctions, allowing them to sell oil to China and others. So the new administration has got to come in, got to land on Tehran like a ton of bricks in terms of sanctions, got to reimpose crushing sanctions. And we have a moment. There are tens of millions of people in Iran who are looking to us in the West, to America, to help them. And this is the moment. This is the Berlin Wall moment. Mm-hmm. Dominoes are falling, but it's up to us in the West to see if we're going to support the cause of freedom of democracy against jihadi terrorists who are sworn to our destruction.
There's a new UN Watch report which finds the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Türk, turned a blind eye to the world's worst regimes instead of focusing on U.S. and Israel. He condemned the U.S. more than he condemned China, North Korea, Cuba, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar combined. He also condemned Israel 58 times in the past 2 years alone. UN Watch is now calling for Türk to resign. Hillel, I mean, what's wrong with the UN?
Sadly, too many at the UN go along to get along. Someone like Turk, he's been at the UN for decades. He's part of the system. The only way you move up is you turn a blind eye. He hasn't said anything about Cuba. It's a police state that has hundreds and hundreds of political prisoners, teenagers whose crime was standing up for freedom. Just a handful of statements on China over 2 years. I think one statement on the Assad regime over 2 years. So this is someone who was failing his mandate to protect human rights. He has no place being a human rights official. He should resign.
UN Watch released another report revealing high-level staff of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. They work for Palestinian refugees. They've been actually working with terrorists. Meeting with them regularly. UN Watch also included interviews taken with UNRWA students who admitted to being taught things like fight back and resist so that Palestine can be liberated. And that Hamas members served as staff in several UNRWA schools. Again, I mean, how is it possible that the UN has all these weak spots that terrorists come in and work on these agencies?
Look, UNRWA is a pathological agency that claims to be humanitarian, but in fact their goal is to perpetuate Palestinians for decades as so-called refugees. It's absurd. We shouldn't be surprised that terrorists make it to top posts. The head of the UNRWA Teachers Union in Lebanon, Fathi al-Sharif, was the head of Hamas. Luckily, justice was delivered to him 2 months ago, and then after a missile took him out, an Israeli missile, Hamas admitted he was our leader. This is an UNRWA school principal. We're paying for it. Biden administration gave $1 billion of U.S. taxpayer money to this agency.
Is there any other advice you want to pass on to the incoming Trump administration about our adversaries? You hit on Iran, and you're right, the sanctions need to be acknowledged. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris actually did not enforce the sanctions, enabling them to generate billions of dollars in revenue to actually help these terrorists like Hamas and Hezbollah. But what about China?
Look, China is oppressing 1/5 of humanity, 1.5 billion people. Just a few months ago, we hosted Rui Cha, a young woman whose crime that she was thrown in prison for was lifting up a blank piece of paper in Shanghai. So we need to stand with people like this. Sadly, too often, China is sitting at the UN Human Rights Council, where I am in Geneva. I'm sitting there, and on the dais is the Beijing regime. So we need to push back in ways that haven't been done in years.
Well, especially since they're actually actively undermining us every day.
Absolutely.
And we'll see if those drones are actually Chinese. Good to see you. Thanks very much. Hello.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for being here.